Camilla's voice cut through the clatter of cutlery, sharp and trembling. "We mean nothing to you, do we?" Her eyes filled with tears, and her hand gripped the edge of the table as if grief alone would keep her standing. Vivian leaned forward, her chin tucked in, her lips pursed in disapproval. "God, Eleanor, you're cruel. A daughter doesn't treat her family like that." Graham didn't raise his voice. He never did. Instead, he shook his head slowly and deliberately, a shake that always carried more weight than words. The disappointment in his eyes was heavier than the sigh that followed. I leaned back in my chair, catching my breath. For years, I'd suppressed moments like this, pretending that silence was peace. But tonight, it all crumbled. My hand slid into my bag, my fingers gripping the phone I'd placed there hours before. I pulled it out and carefully set it on the table. Camille gasped, a look of confusion in her eyes. Vivian frowned deeply. "Believe me, I care," I said quietly. I pressed play. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Familiar voices echoed. Vivian's biting criticism of my food, Camille's disdainful sighs, Graham's fleeting whispers that I should ignore it. The recording filled every corner, an inescapable mirror. Camille's tears vanished as quickly as they had fallen. Vivian's mouth tightened into a thin, fragile line. Graham's gaze shattered, falling to the floor. I let the silence linger, then put the phone back in my bag. My pulse had slowed, it was now at peace. This wasn't a surprise, it had been building up for years. If they wanted to know how I got here, they'd have to start where it all began. That memory flooded back. It began so innocently. I offered to host Thanksgiving at my tiny house in Asheville. I was proud of the place, hardwood floors I'd sanded myself, a dining room that barely fit a table for 12. I loved the scent of rosemary and citrus, and the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen to the porch. On that first Thanksgiving, I felt like the tie that held us together. From there, it just kept getting bigger. Christmas, Easter, birthdays, even Sunday dinners when nobody felt like cooking. My house was the place. At first, I convinced myself it was love. I didn't mind getting up at dawn to glaze the turkey, or turning on the lights until my fingers cramped. Seeing everyone gathered around me, smiling as they ate a meal I'd poured my heart and soul into, felt worth it all. But things gradually changed. Words of thanks grew shorter, then disappeared. Hugs at the door became quick gestures. Instead of asking, they began to assume. A message from Camille would arrive. "We're coming for dinner on Sunday." It wasn't a question, it was a fact. Vivian arrived with her own spice bag, ready to tweak my recipes. Graham always sat in his usual chair, unmoved to help, constantly reminding me with a look that I had chosen this role, so I had to endure it silently. Even the moments when I tried to regain control, by suggesting someone else host the party or that we go out together, were met with indifference. Camille would say with a forced smile, "You're the best," as if the compliment absolved me of all expectation. Year after year, I bore that burden, waiting for gratitude that never came. Love became work, and work became duty. By the next Christmas, I was already wondering if my efforts had any value at all. It didn't matter what I served. Vivian always found something to criticize. If the soup was too thick, she claimed it lacked flavor. If the bread was crusty, she sighed, saying her mother's was softer. Once, after I'd spent hours preparing pumpkin risotto, she frowned and muttered, "That's too much, Eleanor. You'll have to think of something lighter next time." Every word was like a pinprick, small but sharp enough to sting. Camille had her own way of putting me down. She didn't criticize me directly, at least not with the same bluntness as her mother. Instead, she would lean back in her chair, let out a dramatic sigh, and say something like, "Well, I guess this will do." She would stir the food on her plate, as if she were being punished rather than enjoying a meal she had spent all week planning. Graham, of course, never stood up for me. He would sit at the head of the table, shoulders slumped, chewing slowly. If I turned to him for support, he would shrug as if my feelings were trivial and unworthy of mention. It was his silence that hurt me most, confirming that, in his eyes, my only goal was to keep the family gatherings going. Sometimes the table became even more crowded. Julian, a distant cousin, would bring his friends without warning. Unknown faces sitting at my table, eating food I hadn't prepared especially for them. None of the uninvited guests apologized. They simply merged into the evening, as if my troubles were endless. My neighbor Eleanor noticed this routine one Sunday when I invited him over for leftovers. As he watched me pack food into containers for people who didn't even thank me, he said, "You're so generous, Eleanor." I laughed it off, insisting they were just family. But his words stuck with me after he left, echoing strongly at every gathering. The truth began to worry me. That December, I put in more effort than ever before. I told myself that if I could make the evening perfect, maybe it would make a difference. I spent days planning the menu, choosing each dish with meticulous care. A perfectly roasted turkey, carrots drizzled with citrus sauce, warm homemade bread from the oven, and hand-rolled decorated pastries. I polished the cutlery, ironed the tablecloths, and decorated the tree until it looked like it came from a magazine. Every corner of the house gleamed with the effort I had put in. When the family arrived, they didn't even glance at the work I'd poured my heart and soul into. No thanks. No compliments. Just coats slumped on chairs and complaints about the cold. Vivian's first words were a wince at the mashed potatoes. "Didn't you use heavy cream?" she demanded, her voice sharp as ever. Camille sighed deeply and slumped back into her seat. "I guess we'll have to pretend to like it." She glanced at Graham, who, as usual, simply shrugged without offering a clear opinion. The silent approval she'd always been after. Then, as if the moment needed a knockout blow, Camille entered the kitchen, opened my refrigerator, and pulled out a ready-made pumpkin pie I'd bought as a backup. She held it high like a prize and laughed. "Well, at least it'll taste good." Vivian laughed. A faint smile touched Graham's lips. Even that small betrayal felt like a stab in the back. Something inside me broke. My heart pounded. My hands trembled, but my voice remained steady. Without saying a word, I turned off the oven, untied my apron, and went into the living room. I bent down, unplugged the glowing Christmas tree, and watched the lights go out in an instant. Silence filled the room. The thorns in the air stopped. Camille blinked, startled, her pride vanishing. "What are you doing?" she whispered. I looked at her, then at all of them. And I said, "That's it. I'm not presenting any more programs. Ever." The silence that followed was heavier than all the years of criticism combined. It filled every corner of the house. And in that silence, I realized it was irreversible. The silence that followed my announcement lasted only a moment before Camille's voice rose again, dripping with feigned sorrow. "Is that all? We mean nothing to you? After all, you're just going to leave like that." Her tears seemed forced, and her voice too sharp to be believable. Vivian gasped, placing a hand on her chest as if I'd struck her. "How can you say that, Eleanor? We're your family. You don't abandon a family like that." Even Graham, who had always hidden behind his silence, finally spoke up. "Cold," he muttered, shaking his head. "How could you be so heartless?" I was almost filled with sarcasm. After years of biting comments, uninvited guests, and tireless unnoticed work, I was labeled as indifferent. Their anger stemmed not from my loss, but from the loss of their comfort. I straightened up, the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. "You think I don't care?" I said quietly. "But trust me, I care enough to keep the receipts." Their brows furrowed in confusion as I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I tapped my thumb against the screen, and a familiar chorus filled the room. Vivian's haughty tone, Camille's sarcastic sigh, Graham's nonchalant whisper. Each word echoed louder than the last, undeniable, inescapable. Camille's face paled. Vivian pressed her lips together so tightly they almost disappeared. Graham looked away, his eyes fixed on the floor. I left the recording playing until the last of the mocking laughter faded. Then I put the phone back in my bag and looked at them one by one. "You still think I'm cold?" No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a reminder that dinner was still waiting untouched. I went to the closet, pulled my coat from its hanger, and put it on with deliberate calm. My hands were no longer trembling. My pulse was steady, almost calm. At the doorway, I paused long enough to say, "Dinner's in the fridge. Please come in." Then I went out, feeling the cool night air against my skin, and closed the door behind me. For the first time in years, I left them to face the silence without me, and I didn't look back. The messages started that very night. Camille demanded an explanation. Vivian insisted we had to talk. Graham, with his terse, short words, reminded me of my duty. I ignored them all. When the calls came, I let them ring. My only response was silence, and it bothered them more than any words could. Weeks passed. Christmas ended without me, and for the first time in a decade, they had to fend for themselves. I overheard whispers of what had happened in town. The turkey was undercooked. Camille had forgotten to defrost the pancakes. Vivian had yelled at Graham in front of everyone, her voice so loud it silenced everyone at the table. Easter was even worse. Camille tried to host the party, declaring she'd do it better than Eleanor. But she burned the ham, overcooked the vegetables, and watched as Vivian berated her in front of her cousins and neighbors. Camille, a drama queen, ended the night in tears, telling everyone she'd never host a party again. The disagreements quickly escalated. Vivian stepped in, trying to prove she was still the mother who could hold the family together. She forgot to set the table properly, and Graham muttered about it within earshot of the guests. Camille mocked her cooking with the same biting tone she used with me. What had once been fleeting cruelty towards me had become a weapon they used against each other. I didn't budge. I spent those months devoting my energy to my work, taking evening walks along the riverbank, and occasionally having coffee with Theo. One day, when I told him about the messages I was still ignoring, he smiled slightly and said, "I taught them respect through absence. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any argument." And he was right. They were forced, for once, to see what life was like without me, the one in charge. But that did not stop them from trying to bring me back into their ranks. The first attempt came on a gray afternoon, when Vivian chose a small cafe in the city center, one of those places where cracked cups of tea are served in quiet corners. She was already there when I arrived, stirring the tea slowly and with practiced grace. Her smile was incredibly sweet, and her eyes sharp as glass. "Thank you for coming," she began, as if I had agreed to something noble. I simply nodded, waiting. She wasted no time. "I was thinking maybe you could host the Christmas celebrations again this year. I know you needed a break, but you have the time now, don't you?" She almost burst out laughing. After all, she still portrayed it as if hosting me was an honor she'd bestowed upon me. I simply said, "No." Her smile froze. A hint of something ugly crossed her face before she hid it. "Eleanor, we're family. And family makes sacrifices. Children have always loved coming to your house." Her tone softened on the last part, like a needle piercing my heart. I leaned forward. "I've sacrificed enough. I've cooked, cleaned, decorated, and listened to your insults. I don't owe you another vacation." She pursed her lips slightly. She mumbled something about a misunderstanding, then quickly changed the subject, pretending we'd just been talking. I let her do that, but I knew the game wasn't over yet. That night, Graham came home looking pale, asking me why I'd been so harsh with her. Apparently, Vivian had called him in tears, turning the meeting into yet another tale of my cruelty. I didn't argue. Instead, I took out my phone, played the recording I'd made at the cafe, and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. Every manipulative note was clear. Graham sat silently in his chair. Vivian's mask had slipped again. However, even after she was stripped of everything, it was not over. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into the corridor. Vivian's car was leaning against the porch, and Camille's sedan was right next to it. The front window blinds were slightly open, a sign that they were watching me. When I opened the door, the three of them were sitting in the living room as if it were their own private space. Camille sat on the edge of the sofa, her eyes red but defiant. Vivian sat with her legs crossed, her hands folded in her lap like a queen on her throne. Graham remained seated in the chair, his shoulders heavy, his expression unreadable. Camille began speaking in a trembling voice, saying, "We can't go on doing this. You're punishing us." "Am I going to punish you?" I put my bag down on the floor, my voice expressionless. "For what?" "For having to host dinner parties yourself." Vivian leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "You're tearing this family to pieces. All because you no longer want to play your part." I gave a short, cold laugh. "My turn. For a decade, I endured every holiday, every meal, and every insult you directed at me. And now you call it punishment when I stop." Graham shifted anxiously. "Eleanor, please. Can't we just move past this?" I stood upright, looking at each one of them in turn. "No. I will not host again. Ever." The words fell like stones, heavy and decisive. Camille's mouth parted, and a stifled gasp escaped her. Vivian's composure crumbled. Her jaw clenched, and her fingers gripped her knee. Even Graham lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by the weight of inevitability. For the first time in years, I felt the balance had shifted against them. As I looked around my living room, I realized it was time to reclaim her forever. The day after their ambush, I wandered through my house and saw it from a different perspective. The enormous dining table, which used to stretch out to accommodate everything, suddenly looked more like a monument to years of exhaustion than a piece of furniture. The cupboards overflowing with serving dishes were no longer instruments of hospitality, but rather chains that bound me to a role I no longer desired. And so I began to let go. I called the local donation center and arranged for the extra plates and china sets to be picked up. As the men carried them away, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if each piece they removed lifted a heavy burden. Then I put the dining table up for sale. A young couple came to see it, their eyes sparkling with joy at the prospect of hosting their first Thanksgiving. I gave it to them without hesitation, happy to see it belonged to someone who still held on to hope rather than a sense of obligation. In its place, I bought a small round table, just big enough for 4 people. On its first night, I invited Theo and 2 close friends from work. We ate a simple meal, laughed heartily, and stayed together long after the dishes were cleared. No criticism, no guilt, no hidden debts. For the first time, happiness replaced obligation at my table. As the night wore on, I realized that my home finally reflected my true self, not the image my family had imposed on me. In that quiet freedom, I began to see the outlines of the person I had become. Months passed and the rhythm of life shifted. The calls dwindled, but her silence held a bitterness that threatened to overwhelm me. I heard glimpses of their own breakdowns from neighbors and mutual acquaintances. Vivian grumbled at the gatherings she tried to organize, her pursuit of perfection met with indifference. Camille, on the other hand, loudly complained to anyone who would listen about the burden of responsibility she claimed I had abandoned. And Graham withdrew into quiet resignation, disappearing from sight as he always did. Meanwhile, my life flourished. My home, stripped of its old demands, became a haven of peace. I filled weekends with dinners with friends, spent evenings walking along the French Broad, and mornings in quiet contemplation with a book and a cup of coffee. I felt light on the air after the constant burden of expectations that had weighed me down had been lifted. Sometimes I would remember the old days, the decade I sacrificed so their lives could run smoothly. The laughter I sought, the gratitude I longed for, the appreciation that never came. I realized how much of myself I had wasted just to keep them warm. One evening, as the sun set and painted the river golden, I paused at the lookout point and let the breeze caress me. My life was no longer governed by their demands, their criticisms, or their sense of entitlement. I was free, at last irrevocably free. I whispered to the water with firmness and certainty. I spent years burning to keep them warm. I will not do that again.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है दिल का हर साजो समा तो मेरी हर एक तमन्ना तू मेरी रूह का मका तू लकीरों में नहीं लिखा जो तुमने ख्वाब देखा था वफा की इस कहानी में फकत एक गम ही लिखा था सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा मगर खामोश है दुनिया कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले मेरी बेबसी की सूरत मुझे है आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर